So why do owners sell their firms? We find a variety of reasons, right? You may have your longtime competitor who knows your business well, who you see at industry trade shows and conferences, or you battled with over contracts and customers, and they may someday just make you an offer that you find extremely attractive. As well, you could have differences of opinion on how the business is running among partners or among owners, and a need to break the company up or sell the company. And then finally, there's simply the lifespan of the company has come and run, and an entrepreneur who may have operated it for decades, or maybe even a family business through multiple generations, finds that they've reached the point at which they'd like to step away. They'd like to reap the fruits of their labors, and they don't have a necessary natural successor. Maybe their kids are doing other things. They don't have kids. They don't have heirs in the business who are familiar with the business, or who have the skill sets, the necessary skill sets to run the business. So they look to get into succession planning and potential sales and liquidity events. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Alan and Michael, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about what is the state of the market, for M&A for mid-market companies these days. People talk a lot about inflation. They talk about interest rates, and I think there's some worry among folks that it's not necessarily a good time to sell or the right time to sell. So what are the market conditions that affect that, and what should people be thinking about with that regard?
Well, thank you, James. First of all, good afternoon, everybody, and it's really a great pleasure to be here and to present to you all. In terms of the state of the market, it's actually surprisingly strong. We've come off an interesting year in 23, where last year rates were rising. There were concerns about certainly a weak economy or a depression. And what's happened now is rates have stabilized. Yes, they are not coming down, but the buyers really have a good sense of a range of interest rates and what these transactions will cost them. The fears of recession have largely dissipated. There's been a resurgence in interest on the part of private equity. Private equity really has had huge amounts of capital raised over the last several years. I believe the last number I saw was $1.7 trillion in dry powder that they'd like to spend. And particularly this year, because last year was so inactive for them. We're seeing additionally private strategic buyers who are interested in growing their businesses, who are looking for potential acquisitions. And a bit surprisingly, foreign buyers are looking to the U.S. market for investments. We think of the U.S. market as having its challenges, but compared to foreign markets, particularly Europe, particularly Western Europe, the U.S. is really a very attractive market to invest in. It gives them a chance to diversify, as well as, in many cases, provide a lower cost area to do business. So we're very pleased with the market conditions today, James.
Good to hear. Alan, how does a business owner figure out what his business is worth in this environment in an M&A context? Where do they get even a sense for how to approach those kind of issues?
Well, that's probably the number one question that we're asked all the time by business owners is, what's my business worth? And I would say two things. One is that if we think about the way most accountants, attorneys, investment bankers think about valuations of businesses, they usually think about it as some sort of multiple of earnings, multiple EBITDA, multiple of earnings, something of that sort that will help them figure out what the business is worth. But if I were thinking of it as a business owner, I would say that is probably the baseline number that you would use. The real question that you have to think about is what your business is worth to a buyer. And to a buyer, it may be worth significantly more than it is than just a typical multiple of earnings, because a buyer may have certain fits. They may be able to establish geographic diversity. They may be able to acquire management talent, employee talent that is really difficult to get. They may get some geographic balance. They may be able to diversify customer base. And as a result of that, the right buyer should pay a premium price for a business. So typically when we're running a process for a business owner, what we're doing is we're helping them first understand what we think their business will bring. But then when you run a competitive process, you often can be very surprised as to the results, because again, a buyer may be willing to reach in their pocket, pay something more because they really want a particular business.
Alan, can I ask you a question? So we get a lot of questions from our clients about how long the process takes. What's your guess of how long the process takes? And what are the factors to consider?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues there. One is how prepared the company is for a sale. And I think a little bit later on, maybe we can talk about that, about how you get a company ready for a sale. But once we start a process, I would say it's typically a 6 to 9 to 12-month process from beginning to end. And usually in about half that time, you've identified the buyer. But there's there's diligence, there's legal, there's regulatory, there are other things that may elongate that process a little bit, but it's not something that happens overnight. But again, if we're prepared for it, it's a far more efficient, far faster process.
I think we would agree with that. We see some buyers who want to woo a seller and come in and say they're going to close in 60 days, and it's never a realistic time frame. While we're talking about valuation, I just want to pivot to Jordan for a second. Obviously in the sale context, you're working to get the highest possible valuation when you sell your business. You don't want to undersell. But Jordan, how does business valuation approach in the context of estate planning? There's some competing interests there, and you may not necessarily be looking for the highest value. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I'd say it's very different. And I've heard appraisers say that appraisal is more of an art than a science, right? I mean, you need to know the purpose for which you're obtaining your valuation. Usually when we're working on a business succession matter, we're dealing with a situation where we're trying to transition, maybe not necessarily control, but equity to the next generation, and therefore we're typically transferring a minority interest, potentially a non-voting, non-controlling interest in an entity. So that lends itself to valuation discounting. So when you're working with the company that's going to be performing the business valuation, they'll usually look for, they'll value all the assets, and then which may be a pretty rigid number, whether based on a multiple or you're adding up, inventory and placing value on various holdings. But then you're going to apply significant valuation discounting to those fractional interests in the business that might be transferred to trusts or other estate planning vehicles.
Alan and Michael, we often hear owners say, "I'm afraid of selling now because the thought of retirement scares me." Are there options open to owners that allow them to take some money off the table and still stay active in the business?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that, Alan. Today there are a lot more options available to potential sellers. In the past, a seller would pretty much sell out and go home. And I know of a case where a seller told his wife he was going to buy a boat and sail around the world with her. And finally, when they got close to the deal taking place, she said to him, "By the way, I'm not going with you. I want to spend time with the grandchildren." But today they have an opportunity to kind of dip their feet into retirement. They don't have to sell 100% of the business. They can sell 60, 70% of the business, remain active in the business, continue to run it, but get help in areas where it would help them improve their business and, quite frankly, take away some of the burdensome activities that they may not be interested in. So they can sell minority interest, but very often private equity is looking for a business owner to stay on post-transition, often giving 3-year contracts to encourage them to stay on and to continue to operate the business.
Let me just maybe amplify that a little bit. The statistics as to who's selling businesses today really reflect what Mike just said in terms of the fact that there's more optionality for buyers. When we looked at the marketplace a decade ago, the typical seller was selling a business because they had reached retirement age, no kids were going into the business, time to retire. And the typical seller at that point, our typical client was 67 years old. Last year, our typical seller was 52 years old, which is a pretty dramatic reduction in age. And what that really reflects is that many people are taking money off the table earlier, either for many reasons, some because they have the option of staying in the business and taking money off the table, and some because it's a lifestyle event for them. And some want to reduce their risk. But it's really, really interesting how the optionality that Mike talked about is something that has really impacted who's selling a business. And I don't know whether you're seeing that on the legal side also, but we certainly are seeing it on the investment banking side.
We are, I think, Jason, you probably would agree with me. We're seeing more and more younger people who say, I sort of really I can't do this, or I really don't want to do this that much longer, and they're coming in at younger ages these days. We also see some people who are interested in spending the next couple decades involved in philanthropy, and so view the the exit event as a jump start to that. Question for you, Jason. At one point in the process, should folks who are interested in succession planning or sale of the business or liquidity events or whatever begin to talk to their advisors?
Yeah, I mean, I would say talk to people as soon as possible. So, we see a lot of entrepreneurs who move to jurisdictions that have lower tax rates. We have a few clients in the recent years that have moved to Florida, where there's no capital gains tax. So I think talking to your accountant early on and figuring out, in terms of what your options are, would be really helpful. If you want to get a sense of the market, that's something that you want to do when you want to sell your company, and you discuss that with your partners and your family, and that's something that you want to do. I would think talk to a banker sooner rather than later would be good as well. It's important for them to give you sort of a sense of what the market is, which is what Alan and Michael were talking about earlier, so you can have a good understanding of what the value of your business is. I think it's really helpful as you're going through the labyrinth and the soul searching and figure out what you want to do when you sell your business. I would also talk to an estate planning attorney as early as possible as well. And as we were just talking about, people are figuring out their exit strategies and what they want to do with their family very, very early on. I think that's what's one of the advantages of the internet. People are bombarded by all these issues, and they've learned. And they make sure that's part of their planning when they're starting a business. But I would talk to an estate planning very early on, and then of course the shameless plug for you and I, James, I would talk to your corporate attorney, sooner rather than later as well, because you want to be able to look at the due diligence of the company and do like a pre-sale review of everything that's going on with the company. So that's not only is that looking at the business with somebody like Alan and Michael, and and seeing what the holes are, if there's any reputation management issues we were talking about before the webinar started, you can address those early on, or if there's there's contracts that have not been signed, we can help you find that out as early in the process, and that'll make it for a much more seamless process, and you're going to get a higher value as a result.
That's a great pivot to the concept of pre-transaction planning. Alan or Michael, do you want to talk about some of the things that as bankers you look at in helping advise companies and sellers on things to focus on in the months and year before a sale?
Sure. The whole concept here is that the earlier you think about these things, the earlier you start to plan for them, the better off you are. And going back to the question that was asked before about when do you start the plan, it's really interesting. There are so many people today who start businesses with the question of what's our exit strategy, and thinking about that as opposed to thinking they're going to spend the rest of their life running this business. They're looking at this in a much more truncated time frame. But that being said, there are lots of things that you can do where if you think about these things in advance, you can really help to maximize the value of your business and ease the exit portion of it. But they're really tough to do on the eve of a closing. So for example, if you have key employees, the question is, how do you lock them in? Now, we know that there are issues that have come up with non-compete agreements, but non-solicitation agreements, employment contracts, or other things that you may want to put in place now, as opposed to waiting until the eve of the closing, because if you wait too long, your employees will have the leverage in the negotiations. Same thing with issues of contracts with with customers. You may have a customer you had a handshake agreement with for the last decade. It's not going to suffice for a buyer. Have you done the right tax planning? And we talked about estate tax planning. Some of those things really require some distance between those planning events and a closing to protect you well. And again, speaking to someone like Jordan about those types of issues are going to be critical to getting those things in place. So all of these things that are, I would say, not always that difficult to do, but being prepared for them makes a big difference. And the other comment I'll make regarding this is what we're finding with business owners today is that some have really planned well for an exit and have benefit from that. But for many business owners, the opportunity is something that arises on an unplanned basis, meaning that there's a knock on the door from a private equity firm who wants to buy you. There's a competitor who is thinking of selling and approaches you. And for those events, what you don't want to do is you don't want to be in a position of telling that private equity firm that's knocking on your door, we'd love to do a deal with you, but can you come back in 2 years once we've cleaned up a little bit? What you really want to do is be in a position of being prepared for that event and do it early.
Jason, you want to chime in? I'm sorry, Michael.
I just wanted to add just a couple of things to what Alan said, because I agree 100% with what he said, but he mentioned earlier that some of these things take a while. And we found that one thing that hurts valuation in particular is supplier and customer concentrations. You have companies that they've got some key customers, they really account for a big chunk of their business, and they have been very comfortable with a certain supplier, and they are key to their business. And it takes time to diversify your customer base, and it takes time to certify suppliers and to make sure that they will meet your quality standards. And we encourage business owners to do that sooner than later, because it does take a lot of time.
Jason?
Yeah, I just wanted to give an anecdote to what Alan was saying in terms of preparing as quickly as possible. We're actually in the middle of a transaction, and last night the private equity buyer and we're representing the sell side. There's about 30 or 40 patents, and they went through all the patents, and there's 3 or 4 employees that did not sign IP assignment agreements. And the PE buyer last night, said that they're not going to do the deal unless these 3 or 4 people sign, employee assignment agreements. And I think our client's now going to have to pay some more money to these inventors than they would have had to do if they were just saying, well, as a matter of course, we're cleaning everything up, and you should sign these 6 months ago, and it wasn't in the middle of a sale process. So just wanted to give some color to some of the things that Alan was talking about.
That's a great point. Can you imagine the leverage you've now given to those 3 people who never signed their invention agreements, on the eve of a sale?
Yep, exactly.
Jordan, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention that, when you're talking about timing, it's really critical in the context of estate tax planning, because, I think we'll go into a little bit further detail, but a lot of estate tax planning involves, transferring assets ideally when they're acorns, not when they've already turned into oak trees. So, it's not always possible, but when we've got an opportunity with a venture that you think is going to have success ultimately in the future, and you're trying to plan for a legacy to your descendants, ideally you try to ship those opportunities before they become valuable, before we reach that liquidity event where they're gonna get a larger amount of money than they previously anticipated. So yeah, timing is definitely important, and the sooner they can begin working with their estate attorney, the better.
Jordan, we always say that what really matters is what you keep after taxes, not the top line. What's the minimum amount of time that you think a business owner should be coming to address these tax issues?
Yeah, it's easy to say, Michael. And we say as soon as possible, as soon as possible. The fact of the matter is, this is the kind of thing that people seem to want to back burner. And so it waits and it waits, and I guess you're okay as long as nothing happens to change the situation, nobody passes away prematurely. So if we're going to implement a plan of significant wealth transfer, you don't want to decide to do that on a dime and try to get it all done within 3-6 months. We're talking about a plan that ideally will take place over the course of a couple of tax years if we can afford the time.
I'll also mention that, having an offer, right, having an LOI or an offer in hand from a buyer at a fulsome value and a fulsome price is not ideal from the estate planning perspective, right? If you want to do gifting and things like that and trust and some of the things that Jordan's going to talk about a little bit later, you don't really want to have the market telling you, that the business is worth 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, whatever it is, what you're trying to represent to the IRS for tax planning purposes, it's worth.
Yeah, I just had a difficult conversation with a client just this week where they were planning on flipping an asset. They were under contract to purchase it for price A, and they already knew that by the time they close on it, that it'll be worth significantly more, two to three times what they're paying for it, and they're planning to turn around and flip it. And their idea was, let's get this into a trust now, and then it'll be in my kid's name, so that all of this value will shift to my kids. And I had to explain to them, well, if it really is already worth 2 to 3x, you're not really going to get away with using the purchase price as your valuation. If that gets audited, you're going to have some problems. So yeah, time is always of the essence in regard to these things.
Jason, what are the top several things you think about when you're thinking about succession planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think succession planning is probably one of the, most soul-searching things that entrepreneurs are involved with, because it involves a lot of different constituencies and a lot of concerns, and there's lots of options to think about, and they all depend on your unique circumstances, which James alluded to in the beginning. But you got to think about, do you have partners? Obviously, succession planning is probably a little bit easier if you don't have any partners, but you may have one partner, 2 partners, several partners. And have you talked to them about the future and like what they want to do and where they fit into the business, over the next few years? And have you communicated what your plans are? Are they younger or older? We just dealt with a business a few months ago where the owner brought on somebody younger, probably 3 or 4 years ago, and then a year later started selling them the business because they liked them, and the younger person wanted to buy the business from the person who was shifting on to the next part of their life. So are they younger or older? And that's an issue. Again, do they have the intent to stay? I mean, if you choose to move on, to retire for any other reason, or to move on to another venture, what's their intent? I had a situation last year where the two entrepreneurs started the business 30 years ago, and they said, well, if one of us passes away, we just want to sell the business. So these are things to think about. Are your partners involved in the business? Sometimes they're just financial backers and they don't care. They've promised to give you, financing and provide some strategic advice, but they're not actually involved in the day-to-day. That's something to think about when you're determining what you want to do for the next step. And it's also important to think, what do you have in place? As we were talking about, for the last half hour, people are putting things in place earlier and earlier. So if you have an LLC, you may have an operating agreement that addresses some of this. If you're a partnership, you may have a limited partnership agreement that addresses some of this. You may have a stockholders agreement if you're a corporation, and maybe something you put in place 5 years ago, 10 years ago is different than you want to use today. Maybe your needs and your desires have changed. The other big bucket to think about is what do you want for your kids and family? Do you want your kids to take over the business? Do they have a desire? Do you have a brother who's involved in the business with you? Does he have kids who want to be involved in the business? Are you looking for a big, payday so you can go sail off and go on that cruise around the world, which Michael was talking about earlier? Or do you want to keep in the hustle and keep working? Do you want to stay on, make some money, but continue to be involved in the business? These are all things to think about. What do you want your legacy to be? Which is a very individual decision. Is this a business that you built for 30 years that was passed down by your father or by your mother, and you want to keep it going? And it's something that you want around 20 or 30 years from now. So that's something also to be considered. And then something that we haven't really talked about is, what do you want for your employees? Do you want, do you want them to remain with the business? Are you concerned about them having jobs for the next few years? Something for you to consider. A lot of entrepreneurs or business owners don't think about selling their business to their employees, which I think is getting a lot more traction recently. I'd be curious to hear what Alan and Michael say about that. But we're seeing a lot more employees stepping up and offering to buy the businesses. Of course, financing is often an issue, but employees more and more are wanting to buy the businesses and may have a rich uncle who's willing to give them some money or have other financing means. So those are sort of like the top three things that I would consider when thinking about succession.
Yeah, I want to add that some of this planning, right, takes time. It's a distraction. It raises potentially uncomfortable things to think about and talk about with your partners, with family, with other people. It involves paying professionals for advice, but the downside to not doing it, not having anything in place, is really leads to some terrible situations. I'm involved in a situation currently where there's an S corp that's been around running a very successful business for 35 years. It's got two 50-50 owners. They never documented a shareholders agreement. So there's no drag-alongs, there's no tag-alongs, there's no non-competes, there's no buy-sell provisions. There's nothing in there about roles, about compensation, about anything. All the two owners really know is that, for 35 years, we've been 50-50 owners, and we both take the same salary out. We both take the same S corp distributions out every year. And now one of the two owners is very, very ill, hasn't really done anything in the business for a year. And it's becoming very problematic because that person has estate planning issues to deal with. That person has liquidity events they'd like to see happen. And the other owner, who's now doing 99% of the management work, feels underpaid, underappreciated. He's being too generous to his partner in terms of compensation, and he doesn't want to sell. And so it results in extremely uncomfortable position for both folks. And a ounce of prevention in terms of getting these ducks lined up well in advance really is really helpful. And I don't know whether anybody else has thoughts on the cost benefit analysis of doing the homework early on.
Well, James, I think, if you think about what you and Jason just shared with us, I think really the important messaging there is whether you're thinking of selling your business, allowing employees to buy it, transferring it to your kids, next generation, the same steps that you should be taking are basically the same in almost all those cases, because every one of those steps makes the business healthier, more survivable. And so I think, you really want to think about it in terms of doing that. One of the things that we often do for clients and potential clients is we take a look at their businesses and help them understand how much of an increase in value they're going to get if they're well prepared for a sale, as opposed to not being prepared. And when you take a look at that and you say, hey, if we're going to sell my business, it is worth $7 million today. But if we take these following basic steps to just do the right thing so it's better prepared, more survivable, that 7 million could be 11 or 12. It's a significant number. And the challenge there is with every business owner who's spending money out of his own pocket, like her own pocket, for investment in the planning, is it cost justified? And again, I think one of the things that we often do with clients and potential clients is help them run through the numbers, figure out what that really means, and figure out whether it's a worthwhile investment to spend the time, money, and effort to try to get some of these things in place well prior to any transaction.
That's great. I'd like to pivot for a few moments to Jordan and talk about some, trust and estates issue, and then we'll all come back and we'll circle back to kind of big picture and takeaways and all that kind of good stuff, and hopefully some more questions from the audience. And we did get a question about slides. We will have this slideshow presentation, which again we're intentionally not keeping on the screen too much. We will have those emailed out to everyone following the conclusion of the presentation. So, Jordan, talking about planning and gifting and things like that, I know there's some limitations on what someone can gift during their lifetime. How does a business owner transfer these valuable businesses to the family within these limits, and how to take best advantage of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and really always the challenge, James. So just to give everyone a sense for the landscape, if you don't already know it, right now the federal estate tax exemption is about $13.6 million per taxpayer. So for a married couple, if we're doing our planning correctly, we may have use of 2 of those exemptions. So it sounds like a lot, but when you're dealing with a very successful business and you've got a significant interest in that business, we're talking about liquidation value, and that can present its own challenges in if the owner passes away and we're not intending to sell the business, where do we get the liquidity with which to pay the estate tax exposure? So there's a lot of planning that involves whether we will use that $13.6 million exemption via making lifetime gifts, or whether that exemption will be left at the time of death to be applied toward the assets that are includable in the taxpayer's estate. The one major challenge that we're currently facing is the idea that increased exemption to 13.6 million is temporary measure, and it's set to sunset at the end of next year. So we've got a lot of clients that are kind of waiting on the sidelines, but now ready to spring into action to do extensive estate tax planning and start transferring significant interests in their businesses and their other assets in order to take advantage of that higher exemption, because it's a use it or lose it proposition. If by the end of next year something doesn't change and the law is allowed to sunset, you'll have lost the ability to pass double what you might be able to pass following the sunset of that law. So it's really a matter of implementing strategies to use that exemption, potentially if we've got a a business that's throwing off a lot of income and we want to preserve that income for the business owner, but start to transition the equity out to the next generation, we can engineer a sale where, rather than being gifted or only partially gifted, interest in the business or other assets can be sold to a trust for the benefit of the next generation, where, based on the valuation discounts, we've got kind of a set value for what that business is worth. And now all of the future growth and appreciation on that interest in the business is essentially frozen out of the taxable estate, will not be taxable, and will greatly reduce the potential estate tax exposure. So there's a lot of variations on that theme, but that's generally the landscape that we're playing with here. We're really trying to drive down the value of the estate that will be left upon death, and kind of using that exemption where we get the most bang for our buck, in terms of assets that will appreciate, assets that throw off income, and assets that will cause significant estate tax and liquidity issues in the taxable estate.
I've heard a lot of acronyms regarding estate planning, SLATs and GRATs and things like that. You want to go into those a little bit, Jordan, and tell us?
Yeah, we love our acronyms. It makes us sound smarter than we are, I think. But it really, the idea behind a lot of these strategies, the very common one these days is what's called a SLAT, which is a spousal lifetime access trust. And the idea there is that often people are not comfortable with just giving their assets away to the next generation quite yet. They'd like to at least have the ability to get some of that money back into their household if they need it. We never want to let the tax tail wag the dog, where we're giving away more than we can afford to give away and making our clients uncomfortable with their lifestyle for the remainder of their life. So the SLAT kind of gives us a safety valve to the spouse, where we're setting up this trust for the benefit of future generations, but the spouse is also a permissible beneficiary. So if we need to get money out, it's not that efficient. It's better from an estate planning perspective if we don't do that. But if we need to, we can have the principal or income flow back out of the trust back to the spouse. Obviously, that requires that you still be married to your spouse and your spouse still be living, but it does provide us with an opportunity to kind of have our cake and eat it too. So people tend to like that. And then there are other acronyms that you've heard thrown around, like intentionally defective grantor trusts and GRATs. Really, it's a fancy way of saying that we're transferring assets into a trust for other beneficiaries, and we're trying to engineer the tax treatment so that we can limit the income tax implications of that planning. And often we're either taking back an annuity or a promissory note in exchange for the value of this business or asset that will appreciate in value. So the promissory note is a finite value, usually driven down by discounting. The business is the business, plus whatever income it throws off, plus whatever appreciation it has. So that can be a very worthwhile exercise in trying to facilitate a transfer.
What about wills, and why are wills not an adequate remedy for transitioning the business from a founder to his family following his death, his or her death?
Wills are just a set of instructions that you're leaving for what's supposed to happen after your death. And when we say will, I think what a lot of people misunderstand is a will means probate. And most people have a very negative feeling about the idea of probate. They've probably heard horror stories at some point in their lives. It's not always necessarily as bad as it's sometimes made out to be, but essentially what that means is your will means nothing until a court vets it out and gives it legal effect. And that process is called probate. And if we've got, heirs that are being treated differently, if we've got any issues, if we're dealing with courts that are backed up like we have here in New York, the process can take months at best. And if we've got any challenges, any aggrieved parties, it can be dragged out in court forever and ever. And in the meanwhile, nobody's able to take the reins to vote your stock, to manage your LLC, to run your business. They don't have that legal authority, while this is being hashed out in court. So, typically assets that you're going to retain, it often makes sense to have them held in a what we call a revocable trust or a living trust, which is really just a fancy will that allows us to more easily transition assets after death without having to go through that whole probate process. So you would transfer your stock or your membership interests in your LLC or your partnership into your trust. During your lifetime, it really doesn't change anything for you. You run it, you control it, you can change it, you can revoke it. It's like your alter ego. It shares your social security number. It's like a pass-through, but it does facilitate that easier transition where a will might become problematic.
It makes a lot of sense. Alan and Michael, what are the key drivers if we're going back to a sale process kind of thought? What are the key drivers that buyers are looking for these days when they're evaluating companies in value?
Do you want me to take that, Alan, or you want
Go ahead.
So I think, post-COVID had a very interesting impact on the mergers and acquisition market, and brought up a relatively new concept called sustainability. And that is that some companies did well during COVID, and the question is, are those earnings sustainable? There were supply disruptions, there was demand for certain products, and companies now are a couple of years post-COVID, but one of the key factors is, will this increase in earnings be sustainable? Will it continue? And that's important. I think probably one of the early factors or early determinants that buyers will look for. They are looking for many things. We talked a little bit about concentrations and supply risk. I think we look at historical financials and we commented about the need to be prepared. But the biggest factor that buyers are looking for is future growth. They're buying the future. And yes, the historical numbers are important, but they are just a proof text for what's going to happen in the future. So buyers are looking for an opportunity to take this business and take it to the next level. And can a seller make a case for value? Has a seller started investing in the future to prepare for that? Does the seller have a good story to say how they can take the company from one level to the next level? They're also looking for, when the owner exits, is there a team there to take his place? Is there a second tier of management there that can come in and be fairly quickly trained to step in? So, these are quickly, some of the highlights. Alan, I'll pass it on to you to add a few more.
No, I think it's, what you really find, and Mike is 100% correct. Buyers are looking to the future. They're looking to see where this business can go. And part of the challenge that we have as investment bankers representing companies is to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of simply, I'm going to sound, maybe this doesn't sound right, but not be accountants. You can't look at the business with green eye shades and take a look at the business and say, we're going to look at the financials of the business, and that is going to be the thing that a buyer should focus on. The key thing is, how do we control the narrative? What is the story? What has made this business special? And what you find in so many businesses is that the entrepreneurs who have built these businesses have found really a unique, special sauce that they've developed. And it's really critical to the buyer that you be able to explain to them what that special sauce is. And although Mike talked about sustainability in terms of the earnings and those types of factors, the other thing that's really important in today's market is the workforce that comes with this business. The biggest challenge most businesses have is finding great workers. And as much as many of our clients are really concerned about the future of their employees, I will tell you that almost every buyer is at least equally concerned about, are the employees going to stick with the business post-transaction? So it really is important that you paint the right picture of this business, where the value proposition is, and don't depend upon the buyer being able to understand or see it on their own. It's really critical that you paint the picture of the future, where it can go, what the opportunities are, where you can grow this business. If you can do that, you're going to get really significant value for what you've built in your business.
It's funny you're talking about the employees of businesses. What we're seeing with the smaller businesses is that employees are telling the owners who they can sell to in the sale process. So, they may not agree with their politics. It might be somebody who supports Biden or somebody who supports Trump. And the employees are dictating a lot of their values onto the owners, which I think is really a shift. At least for these younger businesses, I think it's really a shift in what we've seen for a long period of time.
I think that's true. And again, it as we talk about the fact that so many business owners are selling at younger ages, really also, talks to who's going to be the buyer. Do they fit together well? This is, again, we will often run a competitive process for a business and have multiple offers for the business. And the buyer, our sellers are not always choosing the highest number. They're choosing someone who they feel comfortable entrusting this business to, someone who's going to treat employees well, someone who's going to honor their legacy. Yeah, pay the right price. That's a given. But let's make sure that all of these other things are going to fall into line so that life after sale is good. You don't want to be miserable after you sell your business. You want to make sure you're selling into a lifestyle that's really going to be comfortable for you.
That's a great point, Alan. I mean, Jason, you're working on a deal now where the sellers potentially left some money on the table because they said, we don't want to sell to in a good sized transaction. We don't want to sell to a strategic competitor because we would end up with a lot of workforce reductions. And so they ended up selling to a purely financial buyer that's going to keep the organization and the workforce intact. You want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. So they did an auction last August, so it's been going on for quite a while, and they're going to close next week. So that's a long process. But so they were considering different buyers, and and they chose, as you said, a buyer who had a similar business but not a competing business, so that the employees would not be redundant and be terminated at their closing. They cared about their employees. It's a family business. It's been the family for a couple of generations, and they want to make sure their employees, who they treat like family as well, will be taken care of.
Yeah, and by the way, that's a good point. But Jason, it also goes to the fact that selling to someone who's not a competitor is not necessarily inconsistent with getting the most value for your business, because very often it's a company in an adjacent space who isn't quite doing what you're doing, but you give them the ability to cross-sell product into your customer base. You have the ability to expand your product offerings. You get additional geography. All of these factors are very often things that make a business more valuable to someone who is not a direct competitor than someone who is. And I think one of the mistakes that business owners often make is when we talk to them about who would be the good buyer of your business, they often think about it in terms of their direct competition. And very often those direct competitors are not the best buyers. It is someone who is close, strategic, but not a direct competitor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people who have businesses, they want to sell to somebody that they've been drinking with at the latest trade show. And I think that, I mean, to your point, I think that's a huge mistake. I think it's really important to go talk to someone, like you and Michael, who can create a narrative, create a bidding process, and these entrepreneurs and business owners are going to be shocked at the money they can get, because it's that going out of their group think and looking at different markets, international. And I think that's really, really important for business owners and for entrepreneurs.
Great.
And you know, if you want options, right? You want that competitive bidding process in which there's options, whether you choose to sell to a strategic because maybe you think that they know the business, they don't have a lot of diligence to do. Maybe they're a public company, they've got a big balance sheet, you don't think there's a lot of risk of closing, or you want to sell to a financial buyer for various other reasons. It might be the highest price. You simply want to have options.
Yep.
You know,
When you're selling your house, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen, you know, situations in competitive bidding process where you get offers that are all over the place, from 100%, you know, of the company for cash to, you know, 85% of the company with rollover equity to we'll do a 51-49 kind of deal where you have a lot of skin left in the game. So having options, I think, is a terrific thing for the entrepreneur.
James,
Absolutely.
James, you know, often you don't know the answer. Owners don't know the answer to those questions when they start the process. We've had many situations where we've been told, you know, I only want to sell to a strategic for all cash, and I want to leave the business quickly. And after the owner has seen the options that are available to them, they may have made a choice to stay in the business, sell part of it, roll over, get a second bite at the apple. It's not unusual for this process of selling a business not to be an event, but to really be something, a journey. And if that journey is run properly, it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be a learning experience. And I think as we all of us who do this for a living observe it, the results are often better than a business owner thought they were going to be, but often very different than what they thought it would be.
That's a great point. Yeah, we've seen some surprising results where folks you thought, you know, were, you know, late 60s kind of folks who were selling, who you thought wanted to take all their money right up into the sunset, suddenly hear a story from, you know, a PE buyer that's doing a roll-up strategy and has, you know, great growth plans to add on complementary businesses, and they decide, you know, yeah, this is actually what we want to do. We want to roll 15% into the buyer and take another bite at the apple in a couple of years and continue working hard for a few years. So you never really know at the beginning of the process where it's going to end up. So we're coming down to the last few minutes here. I just wanted to put up this slide about key takeaways. I think what we've all heard certainly today is planning goes a long way, and being unprepared is unlikely to yield a good result for you, is unlikely to yield the best price for you, is unlikely to potentially have a smooth operation over a number of years or decades for your business. I don't know what Alan and Michael, you guys want to chime in on this?
Well, you know, one of the things we always tell at the start of a process is the most important thing that a company should do is continue to run their business like they're going to own it forever, and yet be prepared to sell it tomorrow. You know, it's amazing. About 1/3 of our current client base are customers that weren't necessarily clients that weren't necessarily planning to sell, but they were approached by buyers, and either we ended up negotiating with the group that approached them, or began a process. So, you know, these weren't necessarily planned, but all of a sudden they're pleasantly surprised what their business is worth. They've thought about it and they thought it's time to exit. At the same time, it's important that they don't get distracted in terms of running their business. Quite frankly, we have a very high success rate in terms of selling businesses. It's over 80%, which is, for industry standards, is quite frankly very good. But I would say the biggest challenges we have in the deals that don't work out is where clients have taken their eye from running the business. They get so involved with selling the business that they stop running their business. So if anybody's going to take something away from this, I think it's really keep their eye on the business, but at the same time, plan, because the value for planning and preparation will come back in multiples of the cost of the planning.
I love that tagline: "Run your business like you own it forever, but be prepared to sell it tomorrow." I think that sums it up greatly. Jordan or Jason, any final remarks?
I don't have
Jordan,
any
you're muted.
remarks, but Hope everybody enjoyed the webinar.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything. I mean, there's a question up here, but I don't know if we're running short on time. If we want to try to tackle that or not.
I don't have it in front of me. Do you want to read it out, Jordan?
Yeah, it's someone asked that I elaborate on how to avoid the freeze of probate. So I think what they're referring to is the idea that things could be tied up while the probate process is pending. And just to give a short answer to a question that probably requires a little bit more detail, it all comes back to planning, right? To have your ducks in a row and have things, set up. So, where people sometimes, will mistakenly say, well, I have power of attorney. Power of attorney dies with you. So power of attorney is no longer valid after someone passes away. We're only left with the will. And if we've only got a will to deal with, then probate is what's going to happen. And that's, that can be problematic in this context. So the idea is to try to either get your membership interests, your shares into some type of trust, which, there are different options, different things to talk about, or set up some other kind of business succession strategy within your operating agreements and your shareholders agreements on how things will be handled while, an estate is pending. So that's the short answer to that question.